But first, just this morning, Secretary of State John Kerry arrived in Tel Aviv on a military jet to pursue a ceasefire plan between Israel and Hamas. Otherwise, there are no U.S. flights going to Israel for the time being after a militant rocket hit nearby. The rocket damaged some homes, no serious injuries. The move, though, has stranded some tourists, and Israel has pressured the U.S. to restore service. In a show of solidarity with the Jewish state, former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg announced he's flying Israeli-based airline El Al to Tel Aviv. All right, we'll follow that in just a moment. And it is a victory for Hamas, though, hurting Israel's economy and its reputation for security. Far more real is the death and destruction in Gaza. 2 more Israeli soldiers were killed, while the death toll for Palestinians tops 600. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel traveled with ambulance crews who must wait in many cases for victims to be brought to them.
Between emergency calls, Red Crescent medic Asim Shahata checked his supplies. He says he can't go to Shajaiya, where he's needed most. We get calls that there are injured there, and they're bleeding to death, he said, but we can't go in. Last time he did manage to get in, this is what he found. First, a face, like a corpse. Then she moved and breathed. 24-year-old Asma Al-Helu had been buried under the debris of her home for 2 days before Asim's team rescued her.
And this is where Asma Al-Helu is right now. She's in critical condition. She's badly burned and appears to be slipping in and out of consciousness.
A doctor tells us all of her family was killed. They don't expect Asma to survive.
That's incredible. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports in the West Bank, Israel is beginning to demolish homes belonging to the relatives of Palestinians accused of violence. David Ignatius, what are John Kerry's options at this point?
I think Secretary Kerry wants, above all, to try to negotiate a ceasefire. The recent development of this rocket from Hamas landing near Ben Gurion Airport and suddenly closing off at least U.S. and European air travel to Israel makes the situation more urgent. It also illustrates the asymmetries in this conflict. Hamas only has to get lucky once with a rocket like this that wasn't targeted at aircraft, but just came close to the airport to change the seeming balance in the conflict. The Secretary Kerry is working hard on the ceasefire. The question is, what is the ceasefire going to accomplish that past ceasefires have not? In Israel, as the death toll mounts in this war, people are going to demand more achievements as a result of the days of fighting and the danger Israel's been in. And they may be reluctant to accept another ceasefire in place that leaves Hamas basically as strong politically as it was.
David, stand by. Joining us now from Gaza, NBC News foreign correspondent Ayman Mohyeldin. Ayman, with the very latest. Take it away.
Mika, we've been hearing the sounds of intense shelling as we have really for the better part of this morning. It is the consistent thumping sound that Palestinians here have been hearing day after day. And just before that, we also heard the sounds of Palestinian rocket fire being launched from Gaza into Israel. And not yet sure, but we also did get confirmation from the other side that there were sirens heard in Israel. And it really alludes to the point that, 15 or more days into this conflict, it is still very much in full swing on both sides. Hamas says it is still very much defiant. It still has rockets. It has demonstrated a tremendous amount of stamina on the ground with this ground offensive that has now killed 29 Israeli soldiers. That's nearly triple the number of soldiers Israel lost back in the 2008-2009 campaign that lasted 3 weeks. Hamas says it will not stop until all of its demands are met, and the chief among those demands is that the siege on Gaza be lifted. There's no indication at this point that Israel is going to do that. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation on the ground continues to worsen by the hour. The United Nations now saying more than 100,000 people taking refuge at schools. The death toll has now climbed above 600. And the shelling today tends to be focused on the southern part of Gaza and the neighborhood of Khan Yunis. We're getting word from that part of the Gaza Strip. Similar scenes to what we saw the other day, with whole neighborhoods being devastated and thousands of people being pushed out, Mika.
Ayman, it's Willie. It's good to see you this morning and see you safe. We just heard David Ignatius talk about Secretary John Kerry wanting to go and work a ceasefire. But if you listen to both sides, particularly Israel yesterday, Zippy Livni, a well-known member of Netanyahu's cabinet, said she sees no light at the end of the tunnel, no possibility at this moment for a ceasefire. What does it look like from where you're standing? Do you see any willingness from Hamas to start negotiating, to even consider the possibility of a ceasefire?
Well, there is tremendous pressure that is building on Hamas domestically, but the central issue has been that over the past 7 years, this is now the third war that Hamas and Israel have engaged in. None of those wars and the subsequent ceasefires that came as a result of those wars produced a tangible improvement on the ground for Palestinians. They now feel they have suffered so much, they have sacrificed so much. There is surprisingly a slight support for the ongoing operation. Although they've paid such a heavy price, they feel that this is the only time and this is the only way they can get the international community to try and lift this siege and blockade once and for all. What we've seen in the past is that when there is a truce and a ceasefire that holds, either side violates it, ultimately leading us down the road of confrontation once again. This time around, they feel that if it's not addressed from day one, that if the siege is not lifted from day one, they will be back in this predicament either 6 months or another year from now, as we've seen in the past couple of years, Willie.
All right. Eamon, thank you very much. Real quickly, Steve Ratner, the Mayor Bloomberg's trip, purely symbolic. Was he going? What do you know?
The mayor, as you know, is a forceful person, and he is also a very, very strong supporter of Israel. And I think he took very personally the idea that these flights were going to be banned in Israel. We can talk about why they were banned, but from Israel's point of view, it's a very important negative symbolic image that you can't even fly to Israel on an American flag character. And he said, in typical Mike Bloom fashion, the hell with it, I'm going. And he's not used to flying with strangers on planes, but
this is right, on an actual airline.
But that shows you how committed he is to this trip, that he wanted to make it.
We'll follow that. We want